So now we are going to look at the great temples at Karnak and Luxor, and then lastly, we'll look at the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. So Karnak is where the gods found shelter. They're nurtured by food offerings, and only kings and priests can go inside the temple at Karnak. So it was a center for the people to come and experience the ritual from the outside to celebrate their gods, to celebrate the rising of the Nile, to celebrate the crops. So they called Amun-Ra the king of the gods, and he's no longer a hidden god. The priests now have him out as a solar deity. He gets human form, and he gets a wife named Mut, and then he got a son named Khons. And so those are called the Theban Triad. So let's look at this map. We have 2 temple districts, and I put the Valley of the Kings up here, and then we've got the Nile River over here. You see, here is the temple at Luxor, and up here is the temple at Karnak. So they're 2 completely different things, all right? This is on the West Valley. So these are the tombs of the kings up here. This is Deir el-Bahri. So if you look over at this big map over here, here's the Nile. And where this arrow is, you can see Deir el-Bahri to the west, and right across the river is Karnak and Luxor. The temple architecture was extremely complex, and I'm actually going to have you do an analysis paragraph about this, which is at the end of this lecture. So I want you to learn how the temple functioned, and I think the best way to do that is by giving you labels in a diagram, and then you can study those so you understand what the Egyptians were doing when they came to these temples. So basically, these temples are all made in different parts, and the parts are different rooms. There's Hypostyle hall, and there's outside courtyards, and then separating each different area, there's these big gates called Pylon gates. And so there's different functions for each separate part that you go into, and as you go deeper into the temple, it becomes more and more exclusive who's allowed to go in there. So imagine you're the average Egyptian. You get to go and just stand on the outside, kind of like if you were going to a modern day event and you couldn't get inside, but it was still so important to you that you wanted to be there, you'd stand outside and be part of it that way. This diagram is the temple at Karnak that I'm going to show you pictures of. The temple at Luxor is similar in plan. It doesn't have a sacred lake, though, and it's drawn out a little bit differently. But these temples have a very standard way in which they're made. So if you look at the upper left of this diagram, you see I have it labeled processional way, and you see these sort of little dots. Those are sphinxes. There's like 2 avenues of sphinxes there. And then those big, tall looking items with windows, those are called pylon gates. And so you can see there's 3 sets of pylon gates in the Temple of Amun. That whole long rectangular structure at the left is the Temple of Amun. And over to the right, where the sacred lake is, there's another temple complex. Only the priests go in there. The king can go inside the Temple of Amun, only the priest and the king. Common people can't go in any of it, and nobles and higher officials can go deeper or less deep into the temple depending on their rank. So the heart of the complex is that Temple of Amun-Ra, and the sacred lake is just for the priests. They would have ritual purification there. So that other processional way is to 2 other temples for Mut and Khons, which aren't in the diagram. And every day, the priests would go to all these different temples, and they'd go to the cult statues of these different gods and goddesses, and they would give them new clothes every day, and they would wash them every day, and they would feed them every day. So there was a large priestly culture built up around the maintenance of this entire complex. I have a vocabulary slide here for you. A lot of these words are going to carry through to the end of the semester. Some of them are unique to Egyptian architecture, but I suggest you learn them all, because the more vocabulary you learn, the easier it is for you as you move through reading of the book. Here is a photograph of the great Temple of Amun in Karnak. Now, this was actually a photograph that I scanned from a slide several years ago. And the date on that slide was 1960, I think, or 1960 something. And I say this just because this photograph itself, we're in the year 2016, so this photograph was taken 50 years ago. I can't guarantee you that if you go to Amon-Ra, Karnak right now, it would look like this, or you'd even be able to get into where the lake is. I don't know how they have it as a tourist site, but this is what it looked like 50 years ago. You can see the pylon gates. They're these very tall, ruined objects that look like sort of half pyramids, and then the ruins of the Hypostyle hall. So I'll unpack this for you a little bit. So here is a plan sort of opened out a little bit for you of the whole complex. So if you think back to that very first drawing that I showed you, over to the very left, we had this great temple of Amun, this long rectangular box. So what I've done in this slide is I've blown up the box and brought it over to the right so you can actually see the Hypostyle hall and the different courtyards. So these very, very thick lines are where the pylon gates are. So the access to the innermost sanctuary of Amun, you have to go through up the avenue of ram-headed sphinxes and through all these courts, through all these pylons, and then all the way inside this inner sanctuary. You can see from this diagram where the sacred lake is, so that helps you orient you when you're standing in that photograph. That photograph would have been taken from the side of the sacred lake down where that other little box is. All of these pylons are numbered, and most of the pylons were renovated or built during these dynasties. And so between the times of Thutmose and Ramses, they added the sacred lake as well. Here's a blown up view of it. So what I'm trying to do with all these diagrams is sort of unpack this for you so you can understand it, because it gets complicated when you're looking at the photographs. This would be the Avenue of Sphinxes. So you would go up through this Avenue of Sphinxes, through the first pylon gate, and then into the first courtyard. You can see the little sphinxes below these columns. Then you would go through the courtyard and you would go into this hypostyle hall. And only the kings and the priests could enter the inner sanctuary. Upper class people could go through the hypostyle hall, or they could wait there. This hypostyle hall was 340 feet wide, and it was 170 feet long, and there's 134 columns in it. This thing is huge. And you can see the largest columns are in the center. There used to be a roof with actually a clear story here supported. Of course, the roof is gone now. Ramses called this the place where common people extol the name of his majesty. So it was meant as a monument to the gods to celebrate the power of the gods and the powers of the rulers that could build such a structure. This is a reconstructed model of this hypostyle hall. So you can see from this model the way it would have been constructed. They used post and lintel, and this is called a pylon temple, is the type of temple this is, designed along a single axis. That is, they just go straight through, moving from room to room. So the worshipers would move from a very bright outside into the deep, dark inner sanctuary, and most people couldn't go inside at all. So maybe they would just stand outside and see these huge columns sort of going off into the distance, into this dark, mysterious place. And of course, they would have all been brightly painted. And so here is a view into that hypostyle hall. These are flower and bud columns. And I don't know if there's a person in this slide. Let me see. No, I have a slide of this that has a person in it, though. It's really hard to get an idea of the scale of this from just looking at these pictures, but I do have one that shows the scale of the size of these columns. If you very, very carefully look at the left-hand slide on this, you can see the obelisk with the sunshine in it. And then if you travel your eye down and look really, really carefully at it, you can just barely make out a standing figure at the base of the second column in from the front. So it's on the left, second column in, tiny, tiny little person. That gives you an idea of how big these columns are. So this is the view into the courtyard. So in the left-hand view, we're actually in the hypostyle hall, and we're looking back to where we came. And then the one on the right, we're inside the hypostyle hall. You can see the markings on the columns. This next one is the temple complex at Luxor. So they're both pylon temples. They both have very similar attributes, although at Luxor it's all along a single axis and it doesn't have the sacred lake or the other temples over to the side. This was built in the 19th dynasty. So you can see we're approaching now through this avenue of Sphinxes, and we're going to go through the pylon gates, and you can see the modern building in the background. So this is the diagram plan of the temple of Amon-Mut-Khonsu in Luxor. And you can see that the first courtyard's a little bit catty-corner, cantilevered. So where we were over on the right, and we were entering through those two pylons that are flanking the entrance. This one has two courtyards. So there's room for more people to come in and wait while the king goes into the inner sanctuary with the priests. On the top, you can see the entrance to the temple and the hypostyle hall behind. And then on the right, I've put an inset of the diagram of it so you can sort of interpret by looking at the diagram. On the very right, those two white squares are those two pylons. So you would go through these three open air colonnaded and then into this very dark, mysterious hall. So this temple was built over a long period of time, and they actually keep building it even into the time of Alexander the Great. By the 13th century, it was already the site of a temple. So Ramses II, who was the great builder, added a pylon gate and a peristyle court. So that's part of the reason why it's so long, is that as it went through time, other pharaohs kept adding more things onto it. In both of these views, you can see the pylon gate and the peristyle court from two different angles. So just remember that these are microcosms of the universe. So all of the vegetation on the columns, they're meant to be representations of the earth. They're meant to be connections for the sky, for the universe, for microcosms of all that's living and all that is and all that has been and all that will be. Here's a close-up view of columns from the temple of Amon-Mut-Khonsu in Luxor. So they look a little bit different than the big columns that we saw in Karnak. These are actually papyrus bundles. Papyrus bundles. I put this other slide next to it to sort of contrast, so you can see how the papyrus column has evolved over time. And the papyrus columns at Karnak were big giant versions of the ones on the left. By the time we get to Luxor, they're actually being bundled together. They're also super close together because they're supporting these stone lintels. So if you look at those earlier columns from Saqqara, they're much more delicate. This is solid, permanent, a feeling of solidity and not changing. It's part of the earth. Here's the approach to the temple through the pylon gates. So again, you can start to see the sense of scale with the obelisk, the temple of Amon-Mut-Khonsu. I hope from these slides you get a little sense of the flavor of these places. But again, I'd encourage you to go online because you can find videos of it to imagine what it's really like. Perhaps there'll be a day when we can actually have an interactive experience with the real thing. The best I can do right now are these slides. So there's two huge statues of Ramses II here. Ramses II, again, one of the greatest builders in Egyptian histories. There would have been a pair of obelisks, although you can see here from the photograph one is missing. They're covered with reliefs. So it's recording his military campaigns. So it's the greatness of the king on earth as well as his place in heaven. The idea of an obelisk is it comes from a manifestation of Amun. So the rays of the sun would catch the stone first. And oftentimes they might have been capped with gold. So here's some details of the pylon gate. And again, this long history of Egyptian stonework, the masters of the way they could fit these stones together. All are fitted with no mortar. So there's just vast numbers of columns in this thing. It's just overwhelming. And when you walk into it, there's many large statues of the pharaohs, not just Ramses, but all of his descendants and the people that came before and after. You can see his descendants down by his feet here, all his children. And here's a person. So you get an idea of the scale of this. Here's the papyrus columns all close together. It would have had a ceiling on it, and then it all would have been painted blue on the insides, all decorated with birds and stars. You have to use your imagination and look past just the remnants of the columns that are left to imagine this entire interior space. And then on the walls of the courtyard, there's all sorts of reliefs of Ramses, various deities. He had 8 wives. He had several hundred children. He had many concubines. He was very prolific. And I put columns in here because you've already noticed that I've been doing a lot of talk about columns. And we're going to see even more columns when we get to Greek art in the next unit. So Egyptian columns use several different column types, but they're all about papyrus or about reeds or lotuses. And then the Persian columns, they're fluted columns, and often they'll have a bull capital. So Ramses II, he restored the belief in the divine right to rule, and he achieved the deification as a god in his own lifetime. So unlike Hatshepsut or the pharaohs or kings that came before him, who were worshipped sons of gods or daughters of gods and became worshipped as gods after they died, Ramses II assumed his divine right of kingship, assumed his place as a god during the time he was alive. He ruled for 67 years. He had 45 sons. He had 40 daughters that were legitimate, in addition to all of the many hundred from concubines. And all of these children at his feet, there's 4 images of him here, affirm their right to rule. So he was seeding a dynasty for eternity. It went up to Ramses IX. Ramses IX was the last bearer of the name. He died in 1085, which was the end of the new kingdom, and the unity of Egypt is gone. So we have now this same similar history that we saw at the end of the art of the ancient Near East. Between 675 and 663, the Assyrians conquered, then the Neo-Babylonians, remember them? They push into Lower Egypt, then Persians, then Alexander the Great, the Romans, then the Christians, and then finally Islam. And so ancient Egypt is lost until the 18th century. So this builder, Ramses II, managed to hang on to his dynasty for that short time through Ramses IX, but then it was lost in the mists of history for over 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years, right? 1279, close to 2,000 years. So the main feature of this temple is these 4 colossal statues. This is in Abu Simbel, which is in Nubia, which is north, and most of his wealth comes from Nubia. These 2 temples, they're asserting his divinity, and you can see the scope of this temple with this aerial view of the mountain here. This is a larger temple to himself, and then there's a smaller temple over here to Hathor and Nefertari. So the 2 axes of these temples, if you drew a line, there's actually a crossing line that crosses right in the middle of the Nile River. He built a huge empire. He was a general, he was a strategist, and his projects rival the pyramids at Giza. You saw the temple at Luxor, you saw this. There's many, many others that we don't have time to show here, but this is his biggest project, this Abu Simbel project. You can see people here climbing up by his feet. That gives you a sense of the scale of this. So he's built all out of these stones and then faced with this limestone facing. So I leave it to you to think about eternity, looking at this sculpture. The inside of his temple was oriented, and so if you went inside, the first rays of the sun would shoot in. It would illuminate. There's 4 statues at the back of the temple that somewhat mirror the 4 statues that you see in the front. I want to end just showing you some of the painting from the New Kingdom because it's such a departure from earlier artwork. We still have some of the same conventions. Note the feet that are from the insides of the insteps, shown in profile, the eye on the side, but much more active, much more naturalistic here. And in these, there's clear influences from other cultures. You'll notice, for example, when we look at Minoan painting in Crete, you'll see some influences from there, that the figures are moving and changing. And this one actually is a departure. The profile is shown differently here. Much more naturalistic than Old Kingdom paintings. So in conclusion, Egypt is attacked and conquered by foreigners, as I've said. Nubians, Persians, Macedonians, Greeks, they're all attacking, they're all plundering, they're taking away the Egyptian ideas, they're bringing their own art, as exemplified in those pictures I just showed you. In 332, the Macedonians under Alexander conquers Egypt, and then the Romans invaded in 30 BCE, so we're right up to 30 years before the Common Era with the death of Cleopatra. Now, I have a visual analysis paragraph for you here, and what I want you to do is think about architecture, because in Unit 2 and in Unit 3, we're going to continue looking at different kinds of ceremonial architecture. So I think it's a good way for you to think about the way that different kinds of cultures would use architecture for their spiritual life and how their actual society or culture would shape the way that spiritual life would be. So if you look at Stonehenge, if you can go back to the slides that we looked at earlier times of Stonehenge and think about the evolution from a hunter-gatherer, moon-worshipping culture to a Neolithic culture in which they start planting, and the rising and the rising of the sun becomes important. They build this actually as a clock with the sun coming over the heel stone, the way in which they gather these stones, the kinds of rituals that would have been performed here, and then contrast that to the kind of architecture that we have in this temple at Karnak. Again, it's a religious procession. Again, it's an agricultural society, although there's obvious differences in a Neolithic planting society and an advanced civilization such as the Egyptians. So they're both examples of ceremonial architecture. I want you to contrast the architecture, the function and uses of these, take the cultures into account, and you'll make it on a Word document and then go to the Dropbox links and click on Visual Analysis Paragraph. So I'm ending with another view again of Ramses II, because he is the last of our strong Egyptian builders, and he's a quintessential example of the Egyptian culture that we've been talking about for the last several days. And hopefully this makes you think about this civilization in a different way.